Well, I hope everybody had just a 8 to 10 hours sleep last night. It'll be worse tomorrow morning. I'd like to welcome you here, and especially those who came in today and weren't with us last night. We anticipate a lot of people coming throughout the day who didn't come for the entire conference, but wanted to come hear one or two of the speakers. So this year we have the highest number of those who pre-registered that we've ever had. And a lot of those are here for the first time, and a huge number are here for the first time. So I'm anticipating some really interesting talks today and a lot of information and personal stories and so forth. A couple of little things that I need to tell you. The restaurant here in the hotel has, for dinner, kind of gone upscale, but I looked at their lunch menu and the prices are about what they were last year, so it is a pretty decent place to have lunch, and their food's really good. They can't handle, all of us going there at one time, but to those that want to stay in the hotel, that is a good recommendation for you. Forgot where I wrote my notes. Those who haven't figured it out yet about the parking in the garage, especially, I'll have to say this probably 2 or 3 times a day from people coming in, but when you come in, you go to the garage and you'll get a ticket as you go in, and then you park your car, you come back to the front desk, and they will validate it for the rest of the weekend. You have to tell them that you're here for the conference. And the parking is free for all of us, even those who are not staying in the hotel. And there will be the snacks that were out, breakfast stuff that was out this morning. There'll be some refreshing of that about mid-morning, and we'll also have a little snack break in the afternoon in case you decide you don't really want to go out and walk to a restaurant. There will be some snacks here for you. Because we've put the bios in the program, we don't do long biographies of our speakers, but Peter Danzig has been associated with us, and his wife Mary also. They have presented beautiful music for us several times, and we actually had almost like a full little mini concert one Sunday morning with them and some of the musicians that they were able who wanted to come and perform that for us. So he has had an interesting journey the last few years, and his work that he does now as a therapist and counselor is so valuable for people who have left the church and are looking for somebody, counselor of some sort, who understands where they're coming from. And I'm very anxious to hear what he has to say today. And I'd like to introduce Peter Danzig.
Well, thank you. Can you all hear okay? All right. If anybody can't hear, I'm hearing impaired a little bit, so I know what that's like. I want you to be able to hear, so you can come tell me, or you can, Steve over here, can gently let me know I need to do something to make it hearable.
Want the other lights off?
Can you see? That's the other question. If you can see, I don't care. The lights on will keep me awake. Now, a brief moment of testimony. I will say coffee, I think, has done more to make my day better than prayer. As someone with ADHD, I didn't know the glory of having something to help me focus a little bit. So other warning here, if for those sensitive people, there might be a couple of swear words involved. but I'll try and keep it very tame. The first one is up there. This presentation has evolved radically every time I worked on it. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to try and go fast. I'll try and save some time for questions. And then I'll be around Sunday morning and for the rest of the conference. If you have questions, want to come talk to me or ask them at the panel discussion. I'm a counselor, an LCSW. I've been doing that for 11 years. I resigned my membership in the LDS Church in 2008, and John's got a Mormon Stories podcast. If you're curious about that story, you'll know me better than I know myself if you listen to that. So I may illustrate some things from my own life, but I'm not going to go deeply into my own story. This presentation is meant to be about the work I'm doing now, working with individuals who are leaving the LDS Church and also working with couples who are trying to deal with being on opposite sides of that faith boundary. And the question I've asked myself over and over in my own journey is, why is this so damn hard? Like, I'm a counselor, I should be able to handle this. I should be the most skillful, I know all about healthy family relations, etc., etc. So, we're going to address a few things today. One of them is, someone last night mentioned that they get asked, why can't you just let it go? So, we're going to answer that question, why you probably can't just let it go. We're going to talk about some ideas about healing, and then how do we minimize the impact of going through this on family and friends. I wanted to start with this poem, which I'm just going to read to you. If you're not already familiar with it, I think it is one of the best poems to start out a journey like this. It's by Mary Oliver. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began. Though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds. And there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world. Determined to do the only thing you could do. Determined to save the only life you could save. I'm going to pass that on to Mary Oliver, because it's a beautiful poem. Now, what are we dealing with? So, I've looked for a long time for a way to encapsulate precisely the issues that come up in Mormonism. So the first point here is that Mormonism has a performance-based salvation system. You have to perform certain things in order to achieve salvation, and there are threats of social exclusion for non-conformists. Now, this, I think, encapsulates most of the problem, because the human nervous system is wired so that threats to your inclusion in your social group are perceived the same way as physical pain. So when you're being threatened with exclusion, it's the same as if someone is physically threatening you in terms of your neurological response. Witness how many people are frightened of social situations. It's very difficult. So individuals who are unable or unwilling to conform inside of this system are then under constant threat of social exclusion. Now this may be present, this may be simply that God can't quite handle you up there by Him and you can go way down there with other people. But you're under that threat and it's perceived the same way physical harm would be. So there's only one word I can come up with for this, which is abuse. This is an abusive thing. Here's the dictionary definition: to treat a person or animal, that would describe humans, I think, with cruelty or violence, especially regularly or repeatedly, as in constant threats to exclusion if you do not conform with us. Note that the definition does not mandate intent to abuse. It simply describes the experience of the abused. So obviously, one thing to point out is that inside of a system like this, not everyone experiences abuse the same way. If I happen to be a person for whom conforming comes easily, or things just match up for me really well, it happens to be a good fit, I probably don't experience that very much. I don't have a lot to deal with in terms of being worried about being excluded. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is programming that happens to our brains beneath the conscious level inside of Mormonism. And here's a whole list of things. We'll go through them a little bit more thoroughly as we go along. But the point I wanted to make here is these are things that can impact recovery and relationships with others. This is, I found that knowing about these can be very helpful in conceptualizing how do I want to work with other people and how do I want to work with myself as I go through this. I'm going to jump right into the first, and I think possibly, in my mind, the most important one. This is deeply tied to the threat of social exclusion that is tied to the performance-based salvation system. So we have a hardwired fear of social rejection, and we, as Mormons, you undergo a process that the best description I could come up with is worthiness training. So lifelong training in maintaining your acceptability so that you are not excluded. This begins at a pre-verbal stage. So before you're able to articulate anything, you're noticing this family system, this church system, this system that says you must be this way or you will be excluded. Now, what does this result in? It results in people becoming hypersensitive to cues that indicate social rejection. And this is especially prominent when paired with symbols or rituals. So this first, for me, my personal experience is I discovered I just could not behave myself when I went to family events such as a baby blessing. And I felt terrible. I'm a counselor. I'm like, if this were another religion, I'd just go, I'd do my thing, I'd say Mazel Tov. It wouldn't be a big deal. But I just couldn't go and behave, and I was so confused about it. And what I realized is something was being activated in me that I wasn't consciously in control of. Now, this John brought up something when he spoke last night about being conditioned to see all of us bitter apostates as dark and angry. I will admit to some anger, so we'll get to that. But worthiness training conditions how we view those who have left the system because they're now unworthy. And obviously being considered unworthy means that, there's some big implications there. So I want you to further explore this. I want you to imagine this sun at the beach. Now, I haven't met a whole lot of beautiful bishops. I'm just kidding. The other problem here is that there's some small print that I didn't put on that beauty will be verified on a yearly basis. We're going to check. We're going to check all the way. So who's going to be in the beautiful side here? Well, you're going to have a whole lot of nervous people, right? Like, I think I can go over there. I'm pretty sure, but what if someone calls me out, Like, I didn't check with the bishop to see if I belong. So you're going to have a bunch of nervous people. You're going to have a bunch of people who are fairly confident that, yeah, I match this description. And you're going to have every narcissist on the face of the planet. Every single one. So one problem with this whole system is that it self-selects for narcissism. Like, if you're a narcissist, it's perfect for you, and quite honestly, you probably don't find it very abusive because I bet. Now, I find this particular example to be helpful because one of the things that's a little hard to get, when you're thinking about why is this such a big deal, somebody last night said, I feel a little guilty that that it all worked out for me. Okay, I don't have a horrible story of losing my wife and my job, and I have talked to people, they're like, well, why is this such a big deal? Nothing so terrible has happened to me. Well, something really terrible happened to you. You lived with this your whole life. Am I beautiful enough to be with the beautiful people? Or am I everyone else? Mormon hell. Now, something that took me a very long time to understand for myself and as a counselor is the flip side of worthiness training. We will all understand what happens to us when we exit the system. We all understand, probably everyone here has had that moment where, that system got triggered. What I did not understand for a very long time is how this is happening the other way. So family and friends who stay in the church are also hypersensitive to cues of social rejection from in-groups. So someone can say to me, I think you're deceived by the devil and are working for the destruction of mankind and God's kingdom. And I can say, I think possibly you're being fooled. And they experience that with the same emotional reaction that I just heard, you're trying to murder God's children spiritually. It's a very odd thing that I didn't quite catch for a long time until I got clear enough to really listen to some family members who were nice enough to be honest with me and say, they started describing their experience of me leaving, and I was like, you're describing what I felt. And that was such a surprise to me that I really started looking at relationships, and when I started working with people, started paying close attention to this. Now, there's another problem here that we'll touch on a couple of times as we go through this, but especially for people who are remaining in the church. Their identity is so closely tied to the group, and we'll discuss this dynamic later, that criticism of the church is experienced as criticism of self. This makes conversations very, very difficult, because I need to talk about what I'm going through, and that has to do with the system that I see as separate from the individual, but the individual can't really separate those. So when I speak what I'm speaking, that's not generally how it's emotionally perceived. Even if they understand it, that's not how it emotionally impacts them. So let's talk just briefly about lack of ownership of self, because this is a big deal. So I'm moving on from worthiness training into kind of the next issue. In an abusive system, such as we've described here, the self exists to serve the system's needs. And so there's going to be pressure to repress any aspect of the self that does not serve the system's needs. Here, I've listed just a few. I'm sure there's lots more. That's why there's an etc. at the bottom. If you think of one that I should have included because it was that important, come tell me, and I'll stick it in there for you. Now, this is a tricky thing because, well, where? Need another sip of coffee, folks. Back on track. Okay, all is well. I thought I felt the spirit for a moment. But we've been rescued by a beverage. All right, so that might have sidetracked me again. So, this lack of ownership of self, I wanted to mention last night, listening to everybody tell their stories. I love listening to those stories because I always imagine kind of this scorched earth and this little crack in the ground and this little seed of green coming up through there, this little sprout. And that's what I'm hearing whenever I hear someone say, I woke up, or I just, all of a sudden, that self, even though there's concrete and blacktop and tar laid out over the top of the self to keep it in check. You're the people who just squeezed up through those cracks. That self came out, and that I think is the experience that so many of us have felt, that moment of relief. Like, I don't have to be buried under this system for the rest of my life. I want to talk a little bit about shame. So in an abusive system, shame is cultivated by the system whenever you try to claim ownership of self or meet personal needs in a way contrary to the abusive system's interests. Shame is a tricky one, I think, because shame is like worthiness training. It gets programmed in really deep. So you can redo your cognitions and still find yourself experiencing shame. My thoughts don't need to trigger shame. It's down beneath the verbal level in a place that I can't access just by thinking about that. So we'll talk a little bit later about how to deal with that. But I wanted to just mention, it can kind of interfere with your healing if you're not really aware of it and pay attention to it. Wanted to talk about trauma as well. So some people have extremely traumatic experiences as a result of religious transition, as a result of leaving. Some have experienced the religion as abusive prior to that. Some people are genuinely, I mean, there's no shortage of horrific stories of abuse, because what I'm describing as an abusive system, that's the best case scenario. And obviously it gets worse from there. And so it's a system for which there are no controls for abuse, which there's really no checking for abuse, and in which abuse has frequently been covered up. I've got a quote here about trauma. The essential psychological effect of trauma is the shattering of innocence, a loss of faith that there is any safety, predictability, or meaning in the world, or any safe place in which to retreat. I think many of us simultaneously find ourselves ecstatic at discovering the self and that freedom, and at the same time paradoxically shattered with the realization that there isn't any safety. That is an incredibly difficult spot to be in. So just a couple of things about trauma. Trauma-related symptoms that you might experience are re-experiencing intrusive memories or flashbacks. Emotional states can be flashbacks. So, for instance, I talked about going to a baby blessing ceremony. One of the troubles for me is that my worthiness training program is triggered. I end up with an emotional re-experiencing of rejection, which I maybe don't need to experience at this point anymore, but it's still, boom, it comes up, and I'm re-experiencing it, and guess what? That re-experiencing is just as painful as it was to experience it earlier. So, of course, that's difficult. You may have some fight or flight reactions. You may experience physical symptoms. You may have nightmares. Here's my recurring nightmare, Elder Danzig. And I discover I'm on a mission. I haven't had many of those in the past year for years. That was a terrifying nightmare. It's like, how did I get here and what do I do? So the other thing that may happen is some numbing. You may have some emotional numbing. This is a defense mechanism that helps you psychologically pull away from the trauma. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention is just grief and loss issues. Here's a list of wonderful tasks of dealing with loss. You have a loss, even though you have this beautiful gain of discovering the self. At the same time, discovering the self at 35, 40, 70, 15. Like, I was supposed to be discovering myself as a child and then really nailing it down as a teenager. So there's a huge loss there if you're suddenly, it's a gain and a loss at the same time. And you have all these other dilemmas of family relationships, and you have all these realizations of things are not going to work out the way I thought. So now at the same time, when I want to mention with family, when you disclose to them, they're also experiencing loss. So Tasks of grief, we'll just go through these really quick. Accept the reality of the loss. This can take a long time, this first task. How big is this? You don't always know how big it is, right? Like, I had a family member get in a car wreck recently, and they seemed okay right up front, and afterwards, it turned out they were hurt worse than they thought. This can be the same thing up front, you know, you maybe don't know how bad it is. You can have denial, numbness, shock, bargaining. Oh, don't you hate it when your family member is experiencing loss? Start the bargaining. That's very difficult. So, these are basically things that help you from experiencing the full. You know, if you go to the doctor, they say, tell me, where's your pain scale? So these are these things here are the immediate medication you can take to kind of help yourself not be completely overwhelmed by the pain of the loss. Then you have to work through the pain of the grief. So I want to point out some common emotions: sadness, fear, loneliness, despair, hope. Oh man, that's a sad list. I want to go to the next line though. Anger. Anger is natural, normal, expectable thing to be going through if you've experienced a loss. And I've kind of put this here. Anger usually occurs when an individual feels helpless, powerless, abandoned, or betrayed. Now, the interesting thing is, for many of us, for the first time in our lives, we're feeling powerful and empowered, and at the same time, we're confronting things where we are helpless and powerless and abandoned and deeply betrayed. So then we've got to adjust to an environment in which which was lost is missing. So once you've kind of dealt with the pain, you've worked through enough of the pain of grief to be able to move. So now I like to think of this as the physical therapy moment. Like, okay, so I got injured and I worked through the pain, and now it's time to heal, and I'm going to start doing the physical therapy to get back to my best functioning. The problem that happens there is this is the moment when you discover you missed some of task one. So you're not 100%, you haven't confronted the entire reality of the loss. So for many of us, this is the moment, we get to the point where like, I'm going to tell somebody about what I've gone through. And you discover that they didn't handle it as well as you had hoped. And that, all of a sudden, you're back in task one, right? Like, oh, this was a bigger loss than I thought. The last one down here is find an enduring connection to that which was lost while embarking on a new life. I like the new life part better. The enduring connection still triggers me. Isn't that interesting? Like for me, like find an enduring connection to who I was as a Mormon sometimes still makes me feel really threatened. And hopefully someday that settles down for all of us. And maybe for some of you it's already totally settled. So, working with family members. We have out-of-phase processes here. So, I mentioned this already. You go tell your family member, hello, I've had a faith transition, and I'm dealing with it pretty well, and I thought maybe now was the time to tell you, and they're like, oh! Your father's tearing out his very short hair. What's left of it? So they're